Appalachia. Everybody in the world has a reaction to that word. Makes folks think everything from beautiful mountaintop views, dangerous hillbillies running through the woods, the rifle in one hand and jug of shine in the other, to trailer park drugs and plain near everything in between. The Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountains in the world. They once towered 30,000 feet into the air. They stretch along the eastern U.S., Canada, through 14 states all the way to Louisiana. Folks that live in these mountains have seen and endured enough things to have happened to them to make a preacher cuss. Hello, I'm Larry Bentley, and I was born and raised in the Appalachian Mountains, southwest Virginia, and I was raised there by folks who lived for generations right there in the heart of them old mountains. Come with me and we'll take a look at some of the odd, awful, or legendary things that happen within my beloved mountains, and we'll be traveling around a bit, looking through the eyes of an old Appalachian at some of the crazy that done spread itself around outside the area as well. Welcome to Season 6 of Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend. Howdy, my good friends. I hope you're doing well today. Thank you so much for stopping by. Now, growing up where I did and being lucky enough to have the grandparents and parents that I had left me chock full of Appalachian mountain stories that still pop into my head constantly. I always loved to hear them old timers, including my grandparents, aunts, uncles, tell about things that they experienced and heard about when they were young. Now, the other day I was standing in front of the grill working a few roasting ears and burgers when one popped in my mind that I hadn't thought about for a spell. Now, we've talked about Thunder Road, that stretch of Kingston Pike in Knoxville, Tennessee, where bootleggers would outrun bureaucrats on a regular basis. Now, them bootleggers, they'd come from all over the mountains around Kentucky and Virginia, West Virginia, and even Georgia, and of course Tennessee, sometimes even further away than that. But like Tennessee, all of them places had their own Thunder Road too. It was back before the interstate system, and a whole lot of the time, there was only one way to get where you was going in a reasonable amount of time, and the law knew it. And you had to just be faster than they were and make a run. Now, when I was a little feller, we used to go down to the dirt track there in Pulaski County in southwest Virginia and watch the races. My uncle, who may or may not have been involved in some of the bootlegging festivities, they would run their car there. I always remember them saying, drive it like Fast Eddie. Now, I figured that Fast Eddie was, just another local race driver until Uncle Mose, he finally told me who Fast Eddie really was. What I'm fixing to tell you is a story that I finally heard told that's pretty much a legend around the hills where I grew up. And matter of fact, come to find out, it's a tale that, folks been telling each other for near 100 years. Now, some folks swear every word of it, just happened just exactly as I'm going to tell you, while others, say it's it may have grew a little bit taller every time it crossed the ridge. My Uncle Mose, he swore it was 100% true, and from what he said, they got all the documentation down in Cartersville, Georgia to prove it. So call your mom and them on over and, have a listen while I tell you all about it. Folks, this is a story about a man called Fast Eddie Pettimore. Edward Lee Pettimore Jr. was born on July 13th of 1904 in a little town called Varnell, just off Route 2 down in Georgia. Now, his daddy was a mechanic and had worked his way into fixing cars after they become general means of travel and replaced horses. And he was so good at it that he could have ended up a pretty wealthy man. But Eddie Lee Sr. had him a taste for the jug and was a certified shinehead that only brought home, probably a couple of days of pay every week. But then, in early 1920, as we all know, the federal government instituted the Volstead Act, which banned the sale and manufacture of alcoholic beverages. That was just another one of their brilliant ideas to get people killed. But anyway, with that came the era of prohibition. Now, the Eddie Sr., he could have turned things around by just crying out and flying right. But he had one of them uncanny abilities to, be able to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory on several occasions. That came with him drinking up his paycheck and moving on to owing money to the kind of folks you really don't want to owe money to. Them folks gave him a choice: take weekly liquor runs to Chattanooga, Tennessee, across the Tennessee state line, or be found hanging by his family jewels from the nearest tree that they could drag him to. Now, being right fond of his jewels, Eddie Sr., well, he chose the former. And after getting his hands on an old Ford Model T, he souped up the engine till it was nothing short of a bolt of lightning on four wheels. Eddie Sr.'s old Ford was fit to outrun about any cop in the country. And the only problem was, well, he wasn't near as gifted a driver as he was a mechanic. Probably because he still had one foot in the jug and the other on the gas pedal. Now, the night finally came to when too much of one outran the other during a high-speed pursuit from a state trooper and a whole herd of revenue. Eddie Sr. lost control, flew off the road, and smashed into a nice big oak tree, doing at least 100 miles an hour. Must have looked a whole lot like an airplane come flying in too low and caught a tree. Now, the revenue men, well, they were following him. Well, they didn't bother trying to put out the fireball. They just let the whole thing burn and then waited to see who'd come up missing. Well, that left 17-year-old Eddie Jr. and his mama, a lady named Mary, with only one way of putting food on the table, and that would be, well, with Eddie Jr. stepping up on some bootleggers and offering to work on the cars. To Eddie Jr., his dad had always been his hero. The way he saw it, his deadbeat lush of a father had actually cleaned up his act enough to start bringing home hundreds of dollars a week. Eddie Jr. knew how skilled his daddy was at fixing them cars up, and it was something that he'd paid close attention to from the time he could walk. To them bootleggers, he might not have been anywhere near as experienced as his daddy, but he was the best choice for them because, well, they needed somebody to keep their mouth shut and stay loyal. Eddie was champing at the bit to follow in his daddy's footsteps, not just because it meant providing for his family, but because he felt that, Eddie Sr. would have been proud of it. To Eddie Jr., money was never the big attraction. Most of it went to his mom anyway. Working with the bootleggers meant Eddie got to work on cars all day, and that was what made him happy. He'd show up early, build, and then tune them engines up like Earl Scruggs did his banjo. Them cars would run like scalded dogs. But what made Eddie Jr. even happier was finally getting to drive them once he had them all tuned up. By the time that day came, Eddie had been building and tuning for a spell and worked his way into being a respected member of the bootlegging operation. Eddie's bosses started letting him test drive the cars that he worked on, just to make sure that they could handle what they ought to, and besides, the engines needed breaking in anyway. And, folks, that's how they found out that Eddie was a dadgum natural-born Dale Earnhardt. The bootleggers had cut out a little track in the middle of the woods, and Eddie was beating track times of all their best runners. So when Eddie was around 19 or 20, they asked him to start running liquor to Chattanooga for him, now using pretty much the same route that took his daddy's life. Every night, when Eddie told his mama that he was heading out and not to wait up for him, well, she'd worry herself sick. But she was just about the only one that did. Rumors started to run wild through the local state law enforcement that the bootleggers had him a new driver and he was nigh on unstoppable. Revenuers said that they'd never seen anything like it and wondered how in the hell they were going to catch somebody with such high level of skills and the confidence to drive like he did. Now, the new guy did things nobody else even thought about, and the cops started to think that the bootleggers, well, they must have brought in some kind of a professional from out of state. Now, they didn't have any idea it was Eddie Jr. in the cockpit of them low-flying aircraft. It wasn't long. Eddie's nickname was upgraded from Junior to Fast Eddie. Fast Eddie was bringing home money hand over fist, with most of it going to his mom, and since he never hit the jug, that made him what we call mountain rich. He didn't really have a whole lot of time for shopping, and there wasn't really anything that he wanted more than just outrunning the law. So he kept right on getting paid, giving mama most of it and squirreling the rest away. Now, the only time he really dug up any at all was to buy him maybe a new pair of shoes or maybe a birthday or Christmas present for his mama. Now, the cars and the chase were his whole life, so Fast Eddie wasn't really concerned with much else. But then came the day when some of the other drivers decided it was time for little Eddie to become full-grown Eddie. That involved driving him over to what they called then a cat house to let him get right familiar with some of the ladies. Now, Fast Eddie had never been with a woman before, so there he was, looking like a deer caught in the headlights while all them so-called Georgia peaches lined up in front of him. Eddie had a wad of money in his pocket big enough to choke a mountain mule, so he could have picked 2, maybe even 3 girls or more if he wanted to, but he only picked one, a girl named, well, about the same age he was, named Lily Mae. Now, there ain't a whole lot we know about Lily Mae. Now, we do know that she was an orphan and then spent most of her life in one of them awful orphanages that you hear so much about, before she moved into the house where Eddie found her. Folks said Lily Mae could out-talk a politician and out-cuss a mule skinner when she got mad. Of course, Eddie lived up to his Fast Eddie nickname and fell right in love with Lily Mae. Folks said that Eddie didn't talk about nothing else but Lily Mae for nigh on a week straight. Finally, he drove back to the house and told Lily Mae that he wanted to marry her. Well, the madam laughed out loud at that one, and probably thinking that Eddie didn't have a pot to piss in, let alone a place to dump it, she took a big drag off her pal Mal, informed him that it would take about $500 to buy Lily Mae out of her situation, making sure that the word came out in smoke as she talked and exhaled the smoke at the same time. Folks say that, she turned pale and looked plumb speechless when Eddie pulled out the wad of bills and plopped 5 big ones on the counter. You bet him and Lily Mae left hand in hand on the spot. Eddie drove back home like Dave Pearson in the 1968 Firecracker 500, moved his mom and Lily Mae into a new place for about a year or two. Everything was real peaceful, with Eddie bringing home the bootlegging money and being the bootlegging thunder pumper that being kept on the down low. Nobody told anybody anything. And every evening, folks would see Lily Mae sitting on that porch shelling some beans and thinking about morning when Eddie would come back home. Then came the night that the rainstorm left the highway slicker than a slab of Grandma's live oak. Of course, the bootleggers needed to run to go through. That night was the only time that Fast Eddie ever lost control and went whipping off the road through a ditch. He managed to stop before he smacked anything by coming to a stop in the mud hole. He was stuck there, kind of like one of them big rigs uses an emergency off-ramp and that deep gravel and just gets hung up in him to stop. Now, he realized that there weren't no getting out before the cops rolled up on him. So he jumped out and hightailed it into the woods before the law saw where he went. Once he ran a spell into them woods, he stopped to catch his breath and think about what a close call he just had. He was just thinking that everything was going to be cool beans until he remembered that he'd left something in the car. Yep, right there sticking on the dashboard big as Butch was a picture of his wife Lily Mae. That's when he knew that he had to go underground for a spell, because now the sheriff knew who he was and where he kept home. And the county sheriff happened to be known as the meanest human being walking the face of the earth east of the Mississippi. Now, Sheriff William Little Bill Hardin was the grandson of a South Carolina slave catcher. Now, what a slave catcher was a piece of dog squeeze that claimed to be enforcing property rights by tracking down escaped slaves or even folks that looked like escaped slaves and drag them back to wherever he thought they needed to go. Now, after the end of the Civil War, being that Big Bill had all of the tracking skills of a bloodhound, he went on to become a lawman. Folks called him Big Bill. Big Bill was tough, but it turned out everybody thought he was a pretty fair man. Little Bill, well, he wasn't neither one. In fact, folks said that he wasn't nothing but a bloviating, overstuffed blowhard of a bully. Nobody around Whitfield County liked him, and even fewer people respected him. But folks learned pretty dang quick not to make Little Bill mad, or even worse, hurt his ego. That would get you a world of hurt raining down on you before you could even as much as fart. Well, Fast Eddie had been completely humiliating the law for years on end by then. So when Little Bill found out who'd been driving them cars and making them look like greenhorns and rattletraps every time he drove by, he was ready to turn Fast Eddie's house into Sodom and Gomorrah, and he was going to play the part of God. Sheriff Hardin and his boys rolled up on Eddie's place about the ass crack of dawn and turned the house upside down, inside out, and set it back up and shook the hell out of it just to see if anything rattled loose as to where the blue blazes Fast Eddie was. And they completely trashed the place, terrorized his wife and mama, but Eddie had long since disappeared. He was still doing liquor runs for his bootlegging buddies, and he still got to sneak by the house every now and again. But where he actually stayed and where he kept all his money was a complete mystery to the sheriff, and the revenue was running around like pups chasing their tails, too. Every blamed night, Sheriff Hardin and his boys stepped up patrols on the highways watching for Fast Eddie. Then in the dusk of the evening, in the summer of 1924, two of the sheriff's expensive chase cars, built just for chasing down bootleggers, were involved in a high-speed pursuit that wound up in a granddaddy of a car wreck. One of his deputies didn't make it. Fast Eddie just happened to be the one they were chasing. He saw the wreck happen right behind him, and he knew that it was a bad one, but he had to keep on driving toward the state line and made his delivery like he always does. Now, Eddie, his routine was to make a delivery in Chattanooga in one car and then come back in another and sneak back on the old roads and pig paths to get back home. This meant that he didn't make it back until daylight the next morning. Then he'd go by his hidey hole and sleep until later on that evening. The next morning, when he got back to Whitfield County, now he thought that he'd swing by and check on his mama and Lily Mae. Now, he didn't trust the no-good sheriff any further than he could throw the sack of monkey dung. Eddie eased up on the house like he always did. Normally, he'd smell sausage and bacon frying up before he ever got out of the car. But right then, all he could smell when he opened up the door of the house was the metallic smell of blood. Eddie's mama was nowhere to be found. Folks, Fast Eddie had seen wrecks. Now, he'd seen men shot and cars burned, but nothing prepared him for what was waiting in the bathroom. Now, once he got to the bathroom, there lying in the bathtub was the dead body of his wife, Lily Mae. Her head had been bashed in with one of Eddie's own lug wrenches, and sitting right there on the floor was a note that said, "I didn't mean to kill her," and it was signed Edward Pettymore, Jr. He'd been set up. Little Bill Hardin, well, he'd just done something that couldn't be undone. What he didn't realize was that when you take everything that a man has in life, you make him more dangerous than a sore-ass bear, because he's coming for you, and it don't matter if he dies in the process. In fact, he'd probably welcome it as long as he takes who he's coming after with him. Now, Eddie was pretty used to being on the run, but with word spreading that he was Lily Mae's killer, he didn't know who he could trust anymore. And that was for one reason, as a whole lot of folks thought that he'd actually killed Lily Mae. Fast Eddie wasn't near the Robin Hood type hero he once was. All of a sudden, there weren't no sign of Eddie nowhere on the highway anywhere. Now, the sheriff and his boys probably figured something was up. Heck, maybe some of them even had a few butterflies in their guts, wondering if something was coming. After a few months on one of them slow Sunday afternoons, long about the time that everybody's almost forgot about Fast Eddie Pettymore, a couple of deputies were sitting around the sheriff's office when a car pulled up in the parking lot and started honking its horn. They weren't expecting nobody, so they figured the honking was for somebody over at the city office. But then the driver just kept honking and honking and honking until Sheriff Hardin got pissed, jumped up, and busted out of his office and ordered the two deputies to pounce on and arrest the driver to shut him the hell up. But when the two deputies walked outside, they saw the car sitting in the parking lot, and that it was no ordinary vehicle. It was a stripped-down Buick Master 6 refitted with a state-of-the-art V8 engine, and sitting in the driver's seat was Fast Eddie Pettymore, probably hanging the flying fickle finger of fate out the window at him. Now, the two deputies ran right back into the office and yelled to the sheriff that the no-good murderer Edward Lee Pettimore Jr. was sitting in the parking lot right outside, thumbing in his nose at all of them. Now, the sheriff wagged his fat self outside just in time to see Fast Eddie scratching off the parking lot and headed southbound down the highway. Then, slogging over to his own car, plopped in while probably wheezing and sweating like a goat. Then he and the two deputies took off after Fast Eddie, driving three different vehicles. Now, in the past, Sheriff Hardin knew that he and his boys couldn't catch up to Fast Eddie, but over the previous few months, they'd been doing some of their own souping up of their own vehicles. So they were pretty sure that this time things would be different. They thought Fast Eddie had just drove into their trap, and now they were fixing to spring it on him. Now, the sheriff and his boys were tearing down the highway at around 100 miles an hour. They meant to keep that hammer down until they caught sight of Eddie's Buick. They ran like that for about 20 minutes. Every time they'd see a car ahead of them, it would turn out to just be some innocent person white-knuckling their steering wheel as a bunch of cop cars with sirens blazing tore past them like bats out of hell. But they kept right on going until Sheriff Hardin saw a dark spot in the road way out in front of it. It sure enough, with Eddie Pettimore. Sheriff Hardin was running that cop car to the red line trying to catch up to him, and by golly, he didn't have to wait too long. What happened next took place in about a second after Sheriff Hardin spotted Eddie as a dark spot on the road in front of him. All of a sudden, that dark spot got bigger, which probably made the sheriff think that he was gaining on Eddie and he'd have him in cuffs in no time. The only problem with that whole thought process was that, Fast Eddie wasn't running away from the sheriff at all. By then, he wasn't running anymore because everybody he cared about was gone. He was headed directly at him with everything that Buick would do. But by the time Sheriff Hardin realized it was happening, it was way too late to stop and get out of the way. Fast Eddie planted that Buick into the sheriff's Model T at over 110 miles an hour. That, combined with the sheriff's car winding nigh on 100 itself, meant that there wasn't enough left to rinse off the road when Eddie drove directly into the sheriff and drove him right through his own deputies that were behind him. Of course, that impact instantly set Fast Eddie and Sheriff Hardin both into the happy ever after and caused such bad injuries to one deputy that both of his legs had to be amputated. Now, when the news hit that Sheriff Hardin had been murdered and that Fast Eddie had been the one to do it, it sent shockwaves through Whitfield County. Some said Eddie was a delinquent who'd murdered his wife and murdered the sheriff and probably murdered his own mama too, since she was still missing. Others said that it must have been some kind of crazy accident because Eddie must have been a whole lot of things, but could have been a whole lot of things, but bad driver just wasn't one of them. But everybody agreed that the whole thing was crazier than a dog in a hubcap factory. The one thing that did make them gloat a bit was that Fast Eddie Pettimore's funeral was about 3 times the size of Little Bill Hardin's. Now, that was because folks that really knew him didn't believe for a second that Eddie had murdered Lily Mae or anybody else. Of course, folks that didn't know, believed that the headlines that were in the papers, and to them, he was a no-good wife slayer and a cop killer. Most people didn't give a dang what anybody tried to say about Eddie, but there was one person that cared enough to do something about setting things straight. What nobody knew was that Mary Pettimore had been quietly poking away near every dollar that Eddie handed her, and she aimed to make it count someday. A few weeks later, a train come all the way from Washington, D.C. and rolled into Atlanta's terminal station in the middle of the night, and it was carrying one of the most accomplished prosecuting attorneys on the entire eastern seaboard. Now, he was there to talk face-to-face with one of his old classmates from Yale, who got a job in a high position in the Georgia state government. Then, that very afternoon, a team of agents from the Bureau of Investigation, which was about 10 years from becoming the FBI, rolled up in Varnell and started interviewing the new sheriff, as well as his deputies who served under Sheriff Hardin. Now, the subject was the murder of Lily Mae. They reviewed evidence, re-interviewed the deputies, and ferreted out character witnesses for Fast Eddie and Sheriff Hardin. And within about a month, they turned up the heat so hot that one of the deputies finally folded up like a lawn chair and agreed to testify against his fellow officers in exchange for avoiding the state's brand new method of execution, which was the electric chair. Supposedly, that was how the G-men got the deputy to snap. Some of them G-men started telling the deputies how dying quick and painless and that thing was a bunch of hogwash. They told the deputies that how they'd seen the electric chair in action, and it was the most hideous, horrifying thing that they'd ever witnessed. One of the deputies didn't do the right thing, and ended up telling the truth about what happened to Lily Mae. Then every blame one of them would be headed for the big lightning ride. So I reckon it didn't take too much for that kind of talk for one of them. Maybe started singing like Dolly Parton in Mule Skinner Blue. And when he did, the whole house of cards come fluttering down. Nobody ended up going to the electric chair, not since all of them said it was Sheriff Hardin that used the lug wrench and scribbled out that false confession. And they probably believed him because I bet about half the words in that one sentence were misspelled. At their sentencing, the judge wrung them out like a dish rag over their guilt by association and wondered how men who'd sworn to uphold the law had seen fit to snap it up like kindling. Then he asked who exactly had went to and got the big D.C. prosecutor to come all the way down to Georgia to work on a case that nobody thought there was anything wrong with. That's when the prosecutor told the judge that his wealthy benefactor was, in fact, sitting in the courtroom with him, and directed his attention to the gallery where a woman in black was sitting with a long veil covering her face. The whole courtroom turned and looked at her. The woman lifted her veil. For a second, nobody moved. You could have heard a church mouse fart in that courtroom. Nobody recognized her, but the ones that did gasped so loud it sounded like it sucked all the air out of the room. It was the widow Mary Pettimore, Fast Eddie's mother. Mary had packed away the money that Fast Eddie had been giving her to the tune of about $500,000, which would be worth about $10 million in today's money. She was like a good many Appalachian. Money was easy come, easy go. So instead of spending it, she squirreled it away for years on end until, she finally had a reason to spend it. And by golly, spend it she did. And that's how she ended up in D.C., greasing up all the bigwigs until she was sitting in the office of that prosecutor that brought the hammer down on the Whitfield County Sheriff's Office. She asked him to clear the name of her only child, and he went on to do it in style. He meant the world to folks who cared about Fast Eddie, but in the end, I guess not a whole lot ended up changing. Eddie's folks and friends carried on loving him, and them that didn't carried on hating him. Little Bill Hardin might have been dead, but, he was now labeled a murderer on top of it. He was hated in life and then hated in death, too. There weren't ever no official apology or anything, not like you might see today if you're lucky. I reckon some were. Fast Eddie's still grinning every time some mountain boy stomps the gas pedal and hears somebody holler, "Drive it like Fast Eddie." Because man don't really die when he passes away. The true death comes when there's nobody left to remember him, and his memory fades out like morning fog in a hot summer day. I hope you got something out of our story today. If you did, please rate and review the podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube, Spotify, or Rumble, throw us a like, and don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you watch or listen. Come on over to Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend Podcast group on Facebook where we talk Appalachian or about anything else you want to talk about. I'll be back real soon with another Appalachian Murder, Mystery, or Legend, and I will see you then.